Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Jay Shah, Vice President and Head Cultural Outreach, Mahindra Group, Teamwork Arts, and the Meta Secretariat, a very warm welcome to the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards and Festivals Digital Showcase. We have had a wonderful season of meaningful theatre and many conversations around it. Meta 2021 has been special, unique, and much needed. And so we have extended this virtual celebration, a series of some more meta-winning powerful plays every week along with searching conversations. The stage will show us the way. Today's conversation will focus on the 2016 meta-winning play Akshayambara, which will be followed by the play screening tomorrow at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Power is an aphrodisiac and also forms the very basic of most relationships, be it between governments and their people or men and women. Akshayambara explores the very essence of their people, of this deep-rooted dynamic, and brings to the fore, through the Yakshagana traditions, this eternal conflict. Even as Duryodhana played by a woman, disrobes Draupadi played by a man. We delve deep into the psyches of these two principal characters and understand the traditions that dictate societal norms. Introducing you to our panelists for today. Sharanya Ramprakash is a theatre maker whose work experiments with language, tradition, and gender. She writes, directs, and collaborates with a range of forms, communities, and theatre makers locally, nationally, and internationally. Her latest work includes her Kannada play Akshayambara, a critical exploration of gender and masculinity in Yakshagana with a contemporary feminist lens. Sharanya is an INLAC scholar and member of Lincoln Center Directors Lab, New York. Prasad Cherkady is a theatre practitioner, Yakshagana performer, and filmmaker. Having been engaged with practicing Yakshagana and theatre for over 17 years, his works revolve around modern and traditional performing arts. His currently active plays include Akshayambara, Sadhana, Shakespeare Nataka Prakarna. He also teaches and choreographs the Yakshagana art form. Surabhi Jyotimari Herur is a theatre practitioner, filmmaker, writer, and poet. Her work centers on the observations of the human mindscape around the themes of invisibility and privilege, and the constructs that hold them. She has a considerable body of theatrical work to her name, a few award-winning performances, and documentary films covering topics ranging from gender to water. More recently, she worked as the assistant director during the production of Akshayambara and as a dramaturge in the play Nava. Surendranath is a graduate of the National School of Drama and a writer of short stories, plays, and a director. Suri is a well-known name in Kannada theatre for over 3 decades. He has adapted many classics of world theatre from Ibsen to Shakespeare, Brett, Frisk, and Chekhov, setting them in contemporary Karnataka to great success. He was also the artistic director of Rangashankara. He is a recipient of the Ibsen Scholarship 2019. And in conversation with Sanjoy Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts and the managing director of Teamwork Arts. This conversation will be followed by a Q&A, so please feel free to send in your questions. Do follow our social media handles and to be notified of the upcoming sessions and screenings and the full schedule. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting to you Akshayambara, the eternal power impasse of gender. Sharanya Ramprakash, Prasad Cherkady, Surabhi Herur, and Surendranath, moderated by Sanjoy Roy. Sanjoy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Judith, and welcome all our panelists. I mean, what has been exciting for certainly us is rediscovering the very rich video material we have, or recordings we have of all of these wonderful plays that have been part of Meta's archives. And in many ways, sort of just re understanding the value of each of these. Akshayambara, even when it was staged in Meta, certainly was one of my top favorite, and I know it's traveled to different parts of the world, sometimes taken by us, sometimes by other people. So it was with great delight that I watched the play again yesterday. And just to start by saying thank you all for doing such a brilliant, incredible job, not just of its design and staging, and we'll talk about that in a second, not just of the acting with Prasada and Sharanya, which was beyond brilliant, but actually putting together very difficult, difficult dichotomies of and the arguments involved on both sides of this tradition, and juxtaposing it, most importantly, with history and the contemporary. So thank you all for doing that. And most importantly, I need to thank Suri, who brought this play to our notice way back, I think, in 2016, when it was staged at Rangshankara, when he invited it to be staged at the Rangshankara festival. And having seen it, he then recommended it to Meta as part of the selection committee. And it really has been incredible. So welcome, and thank you all for being here. For all our audiences, do remember that while we unpeel some of the layers behind the play, you need to come and watch it tomorrow at the same time on the Meta website. Sharanya, let me start with you. What got into your goat, so to be able to delve into such a difficult play? I mean, not just the dialect of it or the arguments involved, but the fact that it was a completely different a form. The Yakshagana form is completely different from perhaps even what you were used to in your theater training.
Well, the play actually was very steeped in the tradition. So it started with actually learning the form, being there. It started with, I think, most importantly, no agenda to make anything. It started with watching Yakshagana, in the middle of a creative crisis, and feeling that this form has so much possibility, so much contemporary language, and feeling like I really want to learn this. So it really started there, to go to Yakshagana Kendra, to meet my guru and say, I just want to stay here and I want to learn. And I did that on an INLAC scholarship. And I happened to stay there and sort of continue to be in love with the form for about 2 years before actually the play happened. So I think it really started there, Sanjoy, to answer your question. I think it was started from a lot of, steeping and marinating in the tradition, practicing it, being there. Yeah.
Prasada, Sharanya talks about the 2 years she spent, learning the practice with the guru. You, of course, come from 17 years of this experience of Yakshagana. What got you started? What appealed to you from this tradition? I mean, there's many other theater traditions. Why Yakshagana?
My childhood was very engaged with the Yakshagana practices and parallelly theatrical practices. I used to get in continuous touch with my village theatre troupe, which is called as Kota Shivaram Karant, which is named after Shivaram Karant, Koshika. So there I used to get NST directors to direct plays, conduct the workshops, and lots of graduates from Neenasam, which is very important theatrical place from Karnataka. They used to come there, train us. So I used to be in parallel practice of two forms. So I was, in my early childhood, I started to be to develop a sense of being critical inside to form. I started to sense lots of questions to be asked to this strong of 1,000 years old tradition, and we need to tweak here and there. So those are all the challenges I have been growing up. And Akshayambara sorted some sort of it seemed like a ventilation for me, to ask my own questions through Sharanya's play. So when we read the play, I was very overwhelmed, and I didn't show any reaction that usually one actor may show. That, oh, it's good or it's not bad. I can't do it. I can't do this. I cannot do this. No, I didn't show anything. I just said there is something in it for me to work. So I will work. I will be working with this. So I started to ask questions. Once I felt like these are the questions I was striving to ask over the years. So I just felt like it's proper ventilation, perfect ventilation for me.
Suri, Prasada talked about how this is a 1,000-year tradition and how he was in touch with his two parts of his tradition. One was the NSD coming to teach in his village, and two, his theatre, this thing. Tell us set the stage for us about this 1,000-year tradition that we're talking about.
So first of all, this is not a classical form. It's a folk form. It's because I would call it a non-Brahminical theatre form. There are no Brahmins in it. It's all the middle class, illiterate people who will be there. And it's basically for those people who don't know how to read and write. So that's why they picked up all these Mahabharatas and Ramayanas. So they didn't go beyond that. Number one. Number two is this particular form was concentrated only in 3 districts, like the earlier South Canada, which is now Mangalore and Udupi. The other one was North Canada, Canada, and Shimoga. These 3 were the districts where it was immensely, hugely popular form. So people, you just have to announce Yakshagana performance and people would throng there. But outside of 3 districts, this was not popular at all. Now, why Prasad was interested or got pulled into this, because he comes from that small little district. So there was no other go but for him, if he is interested in getting into theatre, Yakshagana was the only thing that was available to him. If he had to go to tradition, or if he had to go to the folk form part of it, like. So there has been a lot of experiments after that, particularly in 1970s. I remember I had seen Dr. Shivaram Karant, whom we call Dod Karantru, doing a wonderful performance, of Bhishma Vijaya, where he wanted to popularize Yakshagana out of these 3 districts. He wanted to make it an international event. He was highly influenced when he visited Russia. He saw the ballets and he wanted to do Yakshagana into a ballet. So what he did was he retained the content of Bhishma Vijaya and he redid the form. In the sense, like, till then, violin and saxophone were not used in Yakshagana. So he brought in that. The classicists were aghast, like they were appalled, they were against Dr. Karant. Number 2, he virtually reduced the dialogue, which is again not possible. It is meant for the illiterate. You have to have the dialogue, you have to have the story. When you cut down the dialogue, you're out of the form. Like, you don't have anything that's interesting for you to watch it. So Karant did it, and then he did the entire thing in dance. So he really tampered, he really altered, he really worked with the form, keeping the content as it is. What happened was, like, down the years, it remained to be a very cerebral exercise. Like, even later on, even Karanji, Dod Karantru didn't continue it further. And then there was a lot of people who were against it, against tampering the form. The other experiment I can remember with this Yakshagana is Karanji's Barnam Vana, which happened in Delhi. Now there he used the form as it is. He didn't change the form. Form was there, but he brought in Shakespeare into this. He brought Macbeth into this. And again, for me, it again remained cerebral because Karanji didn't continue his experiments further. So these were the experiments which were trying to bring Yakshagana out of those 3 districts, getting into the mainstream, making it look like a classic, and everybody was approaching it that it has to be declared as a classic form. So now Yakshagana is still there in those three cities and three districts, and we once in a while we get to see wonderful Yakshagana in Bangalore.
Thanks for setting the stage. In fact, two of the, I'm going to come back to Sharanya and ask her about, in this production, she didn't use the violin and the saxophone, and we'll come to the music in a second. Surabhi, coming to you, it's so fascinating what in this revisiting, when I saw the video or the recording yesterday, what was fascinating to me is the way the argument went and the fact that it was an argument. It was a debate between two completely opposite sides. And in creating that debate and being able to structure it between Sharanya and her portrayal and Prasada and his portrayal, when you were actually structuring it or writing this out, what was the process that you arrived at? Because this is so difficult. And then as Suri said, Karan Saab sort of distilled it and removed dialogue. Here, you all have done that to some extent. You've used music, you've limited it, you've kept it interesting by using not just the choreography. Sharanya, when she comes, as she grows through the play into this really very masculine form of what we see, what we know, that what we're seeing today. And Prasada on the other side, each time he wants to do a male character of Abhimanyu or whatever, you see that he goes into the feminine form. And therefore, as Guru perhaps says, don't, but we don't hear it, we only see it.
Yeah, I think what happened actually was that a lot of the context for these arguments was already set in the way that Sharanya had already written the play, to the extent that she had written it before we went into the devising stage of it. And the rest honestly followed because we were having these conversations. Sharanya, Prasad and I were sitting in a room and we were deep into these conversations, and Sharanya and Prasad would come up with these questions and we would talk about it. And a lot of those details was about finding the language to express those particular aspects that we ourselves were looking to understand as well. So that's kind of the way in which the process followed at that stage. But like I said, the context had already been set in the play in the way that Sharanya had written. A lot of it was already written. And then it was the nuancing that kind of came through in the way that we rehearsed.
Sharanya, in the design, and I'm assuming that at some point the design fell into place. One is, of course, the design of the play, which is backstage and front stage. And then the design itself, which was so simple. Yes, you used the tradition of the cloth as the curtain to be able to delineate in the beginning backstage to front stage, or backstage happenings to or green room happenings to when you actually come onto the stage. And then you use that as a power signal. You said move away, etc. But the very design of then having the mirror, for example, to be able to reflect some of what we otherwise wouldn't see from the front of stage or on stage. Absolutely spectacular. So when you were writing it, and in this case, I'm not even using the words writing, I'm saying when you were designing it in your head, what is it that gave you this sort of motivation to do this noises of backstage, front stage, and use every theatrical prop to emphasize the point?
Sanjoy, the thing about the tradition, which is so stunning about Yakshagana, which is so different from other traditions, is, like Suri was mentioning, the idea of the argumentation. Argumentation is a huge part of the form. So therefore, when Shivram Karan said there is no Vachika, it's not Yakshagana anymore, So it was a sort of a very different, form that he was trying to make. So the idea of argumentation is very huge to the form. And also, like Suri was mentioning, since people who engage in it are not necessarily, I would say in quotes, educated. The argument is also ashutvaದಲ್ಲಿ andre like it's done, it's improvised on stage at the moment, when you're on stage. So therefore, a context is drawn from the watchers in the village to the performers on stage, there is a context, and it's highly contemporary. So if I'm talking about my co-performer who happens to be Arjuna and I'm Krishna, I'm using not just the epic, but I'm using the context in which this person exists, you know. So as, in a sense, a backstage is very important for Yakshagana to take place. You need a context, you need a village in which the setting happens. So for me, to write the play, the backstage, the village was the the backstage was the village in that sense, you know. So you had to make the backstage to be able to make sense of the front stage, because without the backstage, the front stage makes no sense, because you draw all arguments from life in Yakshagana, from the contemporariness of the everyday. You draw your characters. So the boundaries between me being Duryodhana and me being this woman on stage is also blurred, you know, if you see it in the play. You know, I use things that he has told me backstage to bring it on the stage and to use it as my argument as Kaurava, and he does the same. So we're constantly using a shared context. So that was a big part of the play. The idea of using mirrors, of course, was, and Yavanika, all of these are part of the Yakshagana tradition, but we simultaneously used it to both complicate and simplify the play. You know, so it sort of simultaneously does that. Yeah. So these were fantastic theatrical tools, you know. So they were just, you know, so juicy and so good to sort of sink your teeth in it and use it in theater. Yeah.
You know, Prasad, again, you're talking about in the Yakshagana tradition, this thing of debate. One person says something and there's a challenge. It's actually a challenge. Now, in traditional Yakshagana, and you've been a traditional Yakshagana player for 17 years, do you move away from script in the play? Like here, for example, it was what was happeing on the backstage. Backstage mein kya ho raha tha? You were bringing it here, and you were then exerting and saying, I am more man than you. This is power. This is humility. This is humiliation. And that became the sort of fulcrum around which you both debate and humiliate each other on stage, leading from what has happened backstage. But is that regular in the tradition?
It is very regular. It is very regular. The expertise of Yakshagana actors lies in there, that in the context of Prasanga, how they can break it. Like being Ravana, he can bring the arguments of Mahabharata also, which is the future, but without mentioning characters, without mentioning Mahabharata story, without mentioning names of Mahabharata, but they can still bring the context. The expertise lies there. These things of kind of play with the Vachika usually happens and hugely happens. And this hugely happens in one of the co-form, the sister form we refer, in Talamaddale, Yakshagana Talamaddale. Yakshagana Talamaddale meant to use only Vachika and Gayana of Yakshagana. Like in the during the rainy season, we cannot get on to performance space and we cannot get into the costumes. We just sit, we just talk, we just use the Vachika, we just use the dialogues of characters, and Bhagavatru will, the singers will sing the songs. So in that form, this kinds of argumentative nature gets its whole exotic the orgasm, I must say. Like whole night we used to have Talamaddale, and they bring all kinds of arguments. One character or one actor can make Ravana is a good person, or Ravana, because of this argumentative nature of Yakshagana. And we have one unsaid agreement that whatever we say, whatever the arguments we do on stage, whether it's out of the prasanga or whatever it is, we should not break the line of prasanga which has been written by this particular poet. Like we have a prasanga called Krishna Arjuna Kalaga. It is not at all mentioned in other Mahabharatas, very important Mahabharatas per se. This is very prakshipta katha. Like it is not mentioned in mainstreams Mahabharata kind of things, which is not famous, where Arjuna and Krishna fights. So in that fight sequence, they can bring all the arguments of other Mahabharatas as well, without breaking the line which has given by this poet. Like in the end, Arjuna has to get defeated, and Krishna has to win. That's the unsaid agreement artists follow. Hope I am clear. I just conveyed it correctly.
Totally. And that brings me to going back to Suri. Again, fascinating, right? To begin with, you said that this was not the Brahmin class playing. Very rarely is it the Brahmin class playing. It's always the lower caste sort of that play. But in this oral tradition of debate, of vad vivad, of debate, and it's finally about politics and philosophy, right? And in that politics and philosophy, what was so interesting is that in all of this, every character was played by a man. Even the women characters were played by the men. And the men had to debate or provide arguments for the women characters. But before you answer this question and set that into the temple tradition that we talked about, maybe I'll get our colleagues to play us the first clip.
ಮೇಘಗಳ ಒಂದಾಗಿ ಜಲರೂಪಮಂ ತಳೆದು ಭುವಿಗಿಳಿ ಇಳಿದು ಪ್ರಕೃತಿಯು ಮೈ ತುಂಬಿ ಮುದ ತಂದು ಪ್ರಕೃತಿಯು ಮೈ ತುಂಬಿ ಮುದ ತಂದು ಮೆರೆಯಂಕೆ ಜಲಕಾರಣವೋ ಮೇಘವೋ ಜಗಕ್ಕೆ ಬೆಳಕ ನೀವ ಭಾಸ್ಕರನೋ ಬೆಳಕ ನೀವ ಭಾಸ್ಕರ.
Suri, over to you. Again, the whole tradition of men playing women and what you were telling us about the temple tradition.
So first of all, like why is that argumentative thing is so important? One is everyone in the audience knows what is happening on stage. It's because it's Ramayana or it's Mahabharata. They know the story like the back of their hand. Like, everyone, even a child would know. So much so when we were watching I come from that district, when we were watching, people know exactly at what time the big character enters from in between the audience. Like there is Duryodhana or the big one comes through the audience and gets onto the stage, and then he's highly decorated and his entry is too much heralded. So we know exactly when they come, and kids would sleep in between from 8 o'clock till that 11:30, 12. Because they wait for the entry. So they know the entire thing in such a way that they know exactly when the big characters enter, when what happens, when the big fight happens. So they schedule their night accordingly. Now, how do you make it more interesting is like bring in extra between the artists. This is where what I would say the expertise of the players come in. How do they kind of improvise? How do they extend the dialogue? How do they make it more interesting? And I believe that whatever said on stage would never go with them onto their personal life. They are the characters. They are the perfect characters. They argue as Duryodhana and Bhima, or they argue as Krishna and Arjuna, but not beyond that. It's not two actors talking, it's two characters talking. So that much ethics was there, morality was there in that thing. Now, why it was being played by only women, and somebody in the research it says that it's too difficult for a woman to dance Yakshagana. But I don't know how she has proved it wrong. But of course, that's in 20th century. But there, when 1,000 years ago, it must have been a taboo for a woman. But look at the Karnataka Company Theatre also, where men were acting as women. Like they were acting as, they were taking roles of women all over. We have seen there are some of the wonderful actors who have in Karnataka who have performed women. So I don't know what was this. Was it the freedom? Was it the economical thing, or was it a social taboo that was there on women to come onto the stage? On an Indian level, I know that because the company theatre also was part of the national movement during the independence thing. Women were not allowed on stage because it was too tough, and then men were playing all the women part. But in Karnataka, in company theatre or in Yakshagana, it's only the men. But interestingly, in 1958, some great thing happened in Karnataka when R. Nagaratnama started her Stree Nataka Mandali. Now that Nataka Mandali had only women. And R. Nagaratnama became famous for performing Kamsa and Duryodhana. You need the strong voice for that character. And she was famous for those two characters like she was playing. And also there is a Yakshagana complete Stree Mandali, right, Prasad? Like there is one, I think Bannanji also started one with women, housewives he started with Stree Meda. So there have been experiments later, but even majority of the companies do have men performing female roles. I don't know why, because it's I don't know the political reasons behind it, or is it?
So let's come back to that. Surabhi, what was again interesting is that the play begins from the end in an almost a Radha Krishna style, where she comes in and very gently, helps him tie the sari to become her, and it takes from the ending of the sharing when Prasada finally offers her the cream. Tell us a little bit about why did you begin from the end?
Again, Sharanya had written that bit very beautifully into the play, right from the very first reading of it. And in fact, by the time I got involved, it was already rehearsed. That bit was already structured in the play. And I remember asking Sharan many times, what is this? Like, what is this scene where he is wearing a sari and she comes and she drapes it around him. And there is this beautiful sort of dance almost where there are no questions asked, but a full embracing of whatever those two characters are and however they express their gender or however they embrace beauty, right? And it was such a coming together of those emotions and that visual that for reasons that I could not even understand at that point, it was so moving. It was so moving to see that connection was vulnerable. And in the beginning of the play, that connection is one of beauty, one of kind of coming together and appreciating each other. Even though it is surreal, it is not really set in reality in that sense. But at the end, it's a coming together in vulnerability, in kind of...
It's an acceptance. And we'll come to the ending in a second. Surabhi, as the outsider, because you said, right, that Sharanya had already written this, the rehearsals had already begun. You came into this to see this, the man playing the woman versus the woman playing the man, and the dynamics that shaped the play. As an outsider, when you first stepped in, how did that work? How did that pan out? How was the dynamics? How did the dynamics move between the two?
I think one of the things that really struck me from the time Sharanya first read the play was the idea of subverting it, right? And kind of then having the opportunity to ask these questions from an entirely different position. I have to say, part of me was really so interested in this play because as a college student, I went to a women's college and I only played male roles at that point. And the criticism that I always got in playing those male roles was always about whether I was male enough. It was not about how I portrayed the emotion. It was not about how, whether someone was moved by what was being said by the character, none of that. All measurements were made against whether I was male enough in those roles. And that was really deeply interesting to me to discover in this play. Even in our interactions with the audience post the first playing of the play, it was always interesting to see, so then what is the language for someone who is entering an art form all new? What is the language? Is there a possibility for any other language? Is there a possibility for any other dynamic in that sense, right? And so much of the play, so much of the building of the play was about finding that language, finding
that language and being male enough. Let's look at the second clip that we have.
ಮತ್ತೆ ಭಟ್ರಿಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಯಾವ ವೇಷ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ? ಓಡಂಗಿಯ ಬಾಲಗೋಪಾಲ
ಅಲ್ಲ
ಮತ್ತೆಂತ ಈ ಬಟ್ಟೆಲ್ಲ ಹಾಕೊಂಡು ತೆರೆ ಹಿಡಿಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದ್ರ? ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
ಇಲ್ಲ
ಮತ್ತೆಂತ
ಕೌರವ.
Sharanya, it must have been quite something first going to the guru and saying, "Hey, I want to learn as a woman." And then second, saying that I'm going to play this role as the Kaurava. And taking what from Surabhi said, so those two as one question, and then taking from what Surabhi said, where did you find the male in you? Because finally it's about power, right? This entire thing, it's irrelevant whether you're male or female. It's about who has the power and how do you wield power. And you wielded power as the woman playing the man against the man playing the woman. And you take off his pallu and say, so what are you hiding? Fascinating. Tell us.
Well, I think it's very, like Surabhi was so rightly saying, a lot of it, because you enter a form that has been traditionally done and performed and designed for men for the last 1,000 years. So where do you see yourself? So my fundamental question really was, this is stage. Stage is a lie, Here, if we die, we don't die. If, I marry, I don't marry, it's a lie, essentially. So if I'm a bird, yes, I'm a bird, So if a man comes on stage and says I'm a woman, that's fine. But why doesn't the same apply for me? Because it's a lie. You should be able to say, yes, okay, go on. So why doesn't the go on exist for me? Was really the question. So I think the question, importantly, was within the tradition. I said the tradition allows this. It allows all of this, except this. Why? So I think the questions that we asked was always an extension of the culture itself. So I think that was very important about the play. But while I use all of the aspects of Yakshagana, in the man that I portray, I also never give up on selfhood. The argument that the woman makes is always comes from her own experience. So when Yakshagana performers who are very good arthadharis, who do a lot of vachika, they always tell me, I loved the arguments you made, because those arguments to them sound very fresh. So those arguments, for example, when I play Dushasana and I'm disrobing Draupadi, and Prasad playing Draupadi says, I can't come because I'm menstruating. I say, so what? Menstrual blood is sacred. Come and show us your blood, Men like me, we spill blood on the battlefield and take life, but you spill blood to give life. Your blood is sacred. Tambula the kempu, so you sort of subvert the language of shame around menstruation. And only a woman as a man can do that, it's only a language that me as a Veshadhari can say at that point. It's not something that the men who've performed as Dushasana have ever said in that tradition. So while all of the tools are used, it never gives up on its selfhood. It constantly defies and reestablishes and redefines this idea of masculinity. And I think that's where the play's heart is, that it wants to redefine masculinity, even for someone like Dushasana, who's the epitome of this version of masculinity. And therefore the choice of Draupadi Vastrapaharana as a play as the prasanga in which we place this.
Absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to ask for the third clip to be played. But before that, Prasada, I'm going to also start taking questions from the audience as we head towards the end. So, Prasada, the question to you from Shreya Ishani asks, what do you think is more challenging, a man portraying a woman or vice versa? And what implications do you think it has on the psyche? But hold that answer. Please, the third clip, please.
ಹೇಯ್ ನೀನಂತ ದುಶಾಸನದ ಪಾತ್ರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದ ಇಲ್ಲ ಮೆಂಟಲ್ ಪಾತ್ರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದ ಹೇಯ್ ಎತ್ತದ ದುರಂಗದಲ್ಲಿ ನೀನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಎತ್ತದ ಮುಟ್ಟಿದ ರಕ್ತ ತೋರಿಸು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ
ಪಾಪ ಪರ್ಸಲೇ ತಗೊಂಡ್ಬಿಟ್ರಾ
ಹೇಯ್
ನೀವೆಲ್ಲ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ದ್ರೌಪದಿಗೆ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ನಿಮಗೆ ಮುಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯವೇ ಇಲ್ವಲ್ಲ
ಸುಳ್ಳೆ ಮಗಳೇ ನಿನಗೆ ಚಪ್ಪಾಳೆಯ ಮದ ತಲೆಗೆ ಏರಿದೆ ನಿನ್ನ ಮೇಳಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದ
ದುಶಾಸನನ್ ಪಾತ್ರ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಅಂತಿದ್ದಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡಿದಲ್ಲ ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಗ್ಲಿಲ್ವಾ ನಿನಗೆ ಇನ್ನೇನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು ಗಂಡಸ್ರೆಲ್ಲ ಹೀಗೆ ಮಾಡೋದು ನೋಡಿದೀನಿ ನಾನು ಇನ್ನೇನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು ಹೆಂಗ್ಸ್ ತರ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಗ್ತಿತ್ತ ನಿನಗೆ
ಇನ್ನು ಮೇಳಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಾಗಿಂದ ಸಹಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾನೆ ಇವತ್ತು ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಯ್ತು
ನಿಮ್ಮ ಹೆಣ್ತನಕ್ ನೋವಾಗ್ಬಿಡ್ತಾ ನಿಮ್ ಮೃದುವಾದ ಮನ್ಸು ಮುರಿದೋಯ್ತು ಅಯ್ಯೋ ಪಾಪ ಹೇಳ್ಬಾರ್ದು
ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀನಿ ನೀನು
When you play the woman as the man, can you take that sense of what men tend to do, use violence to dominate?
That's very disturbing to watch that clip and to answer. It's always kind of takes a little time to get out of that one. You asked about difficulties of playing the role particular to gender. I would like to say that it's all about skill. Like if one actor will be told by the gurus that you cannot play Strivesha because you don't have that skill, that is kind of undermining him, that I don't have certain kind of skills. So it's all about skill. So all the Yakshagana actors who wants to play Strivesha, they will be equipped with certain skills of certain kinds of movements and certain kinds of the Striveshas always does very rigorous steps, like very kinds of drutagati steps, very chota kiru hedges, like that. So they should be able to do that, and they should be very good with their rhythm sense. They should be very good with their vachika, with shruti, with the pitch. So these are all the skills. So I don't see any level of difficulties there. But you mentioned that what it affects with the psyche, that little affects a bit. And I have seen lots of Strivesha dharis and I have seen lots of Purushavesha dharis being affected by the kinds of role they play. Like, these are very personal experiences and never documented, I guess. Lots of Striveshas are being seen as androgynous body language persons or having homosexual relationships. These are all the stigma they kind of carry in the place of society, and they will be subjected to kinds of little bit of abuses as well. But fortunately they will be able to come out of that when they will be able to face those questions, because they clearly know that they are actors and they are being paid for that, and they are being paid and they are being worshipped because of their skills. But there are lots of these kinds of stigma attached to that also. So in that sense, the psyche will be get affected a little bit in the personal level. So that's what I wanted to comment on her questions. You are Sanjoy, you are muted. Sorry,
Suri Dheeraj Kumar asks, what's the role of gender in modern contemporary theatre today?
It's quite a difficult thing to answer. But you see, that has to be questioned. The gender, what you call that, hegemony, I call, has to be questioned. I remember another fantastic experiment, a play, Roop Arupa by Tripurari. I think the guy won the Meta Award, which also talks about the same thing. You see, it happens in the Nautanki, this happens in Yakshagana. let's look at how this play, Akshayambara, questions that that male hegemony. Like in the opening scene, what Sharanya is doing is deconstructing the power and reconstructing a character. Now, you see a powerful man naked is getting into a costume. It's getting into a costume that belongs to a woman. And it's very difficult for a man to kind of openly do that, accept that, okay, my power is being disrobed, like, and at one point of time, he is a man, he is powerful, but he's getting into another character, which is entirely opposite to him. So there are two things that are happening: a deconstruction of the human, a man. You see, immediately after getting into the robe, he does something which I don't want to tell now. He does something off stage. Not it goes to the wing and it does something. But second, it's the masculine arrogance. I love that particular bit. That's how you have to question. The male hegemony has to be questioned. Like I've seen a lot of things happening there. It's tough to answer.
No, but that, in fact, what you alluded to was fascinating. In fact, even more when Sharanya, after the argument, puts on her equivalent of her lion guard piece. Fascinating. As we're rushing to the close, I'm going to ask for the last clip to be played, and then I'll ask the question. Can we have the last clip? Says, what was your approach to writing a script that combines aspects of mythology while keeping the narrative contemporary? But more importantly, in this last sequence that we saw, the thrill that you see of power being wielded over another person. And finally, the play is about power. Yes, it's about gender, but primarily it's about power. When you were doing this as a woman, and we every day read a story about rape somewhere in this country, every minute it happens. And we see this as a play of power between one caste and the other, one person and the other, those most stronger against those most weaker. What was your experience of playing that role? And how did you channel that in this particular thing? Because this scene comes at the back of an enormous argument between you and Prasad as the man, not just as the man and woman on stage, but as the man and woman behind this.
Yeah, well, I think that's the unfortunate thing about how men are pushed. You to be taken seriously, you have to be a particular type of man. There is a certain aggression, a certain power that you must display to be the man. The boys club makes sure that you do that. So you cannot be, like Prasada was talking about, the Srivesha, feminine man, a different kind of man. It's always becomes that boy then becomes the person you pick on, who's constantly picked on, cannot display vulnerability, cannot display a certain amount of femininity, so-called, cannot do that. He has to be a particular type of man to be taken seriously. And, through the play's construction, the way it is constructed is me, when I get into Vesha, my character gets into Vesha to play the man, no matter how many, Duryodhana starts very reasonably, making arguments, but it escalates and escalates to be taken seriously you have to be Dushasana, so you become Dushasana, who's then, full of power. But I think the beautiful moment of the play is to reject that, to say, I don't want to be this. I have been pushed to do this, the same way that Prasada's character is pushed to be too. There's a certain sense of masculinity that we are both pushed towards. But I think the beautiful thing about the play is that while it builds it up to that point and then rejects it and says, this is not what we want.
Well, that gives us hope for India as well as for many countries where it is.
And we hope that if this has never been done by any male character who played Dushasana, that moment of pause in the sari, like Shanta Gokhale mentioned in her review, which was so beautiful. She said that moment of pause while you're pulling the sari. Where is that moment of pause? And everything is contained in that moment when you say, is this right? When that character does that. So I feel tradition cannot be changed, but you can pause it and you can think about whether this is okay or not. I think that's important.
Surabhi, last question. We have 2 minutes left. You've seen the play as an outsider, and you've seen it evolving. And like any production, as the play builds, it evolves. Whatever the playwright has written falls into place, falls into context. The characters get rounded, the dialogues get whatever. Tell us what you saw in this evolution of this very historical play.
Yeah, I think when we first started, it was really about very specific things in my own inquiry as we worked on the play together. And a lot kind of came to light as we kept building. But towards the end, and even now as I sit here, I feel like, there are so many conversations around privilege that I had never had before. There's an intersectionality in the play, which we didn't even understand maybe fully while we were building it, which we understand in a much deeper way today, even as more and more shows go on. But it was there, those questions were there, and they were being asked. They were being asked of, even Prasada's character. He makes this argument about why he needs to hang on to this job, to this work. This is work for him. And that's not something that's a reality for her character. At the same time, she is able to say things in her character which she has never, ever possibly been able to say out in the open, being a woman. And so just what does that do to people?
Surendranath, Prasada, Sharanya, Surabhi, thank you all for once again creating this magnificent production. And for all of you watching today, it is a magnificent production. We wish that you could have seen the energy in person, but the second best, but not necessarily in that sequence, is to watch it up front and close, filmed for you on Meta tomorrow. So please do watch it. Thank you all for this absolutely fascinating conversation, unraveling the back end of this play, the process, so many unresolved questions of power, violence, of companionship, of a collective empathy. But perhaps we'll delve into this in some of your future work. Judith, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you, Sharanya, Prasad, Surabhi, and Surendranath for such an incredible session. And thank you, Sanjoy, for being a fabulous moderator. Once again, we would like to thank the Mahindras for their unstinted support for the arts. And thank you all for watching and being a great audience. Hope this session sparked your curiosity to watch the play tomorrow. If you liked this conversation, please comment, share, and spread the word. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the notifications for the upcoming plays and the live conversations. All these conversations will be available to view on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Please log back on at 7 p.m. IST tomorrow for the screening of Akshayambara, written and directed by Sharanya Ramprakash, produced by Dramanon and supported by the India Foundation of the Arts. It is an experimental play that uses modern theatrical tools and the dance drama form of Yakshagana to create a contemporary narrative that raises questions on female representation and male ownership. Thank you once again, and see you all tomorrow.